Thank you for joining me. This is Podcasting Q&A. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, podcast.com, and boy, is this a great week to be a podcaster. Apple has announced some really cool new features coming in iOS 11 as well as macOS, some stuff that I think podcasters will really appreciate and podcast consumers will also appreciate because they'll be updating the podcast app. So I want to start with that, but I also have some other podcasting questions that I'll be answering during this live event. I do this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at the audacitypodcast.com/live. William asked about podcast formats, encoding formats, and a strange recording behavior he's noticed in his software. Derek wants to know about the actual code to add the author tag to individual episodes if you're using Libsyn's RSS feed. Andrea asked about using a simple host and whether I recommend Blubrry and some branding concerns with Blubrry. Daniel asked about SEO and episode URLs. And lastly, Sarah asked about a good way to start a podcast, jumping right in or starting out with more of an introduction. So if that interests you, then stick around and feel free to ask your own comments or ask your own questions in the comments for this video if you're watching it live. And I do this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern, theaudacitypodcast.com/live, and upload the video to YouTube also. So subscribe, follow, turn on those notifications, all of that, so that you can make sure you catch this information. So jumping into Apple's announcement, they had the WWDC, which is the Worldwide Developers Conference, just recently in California, and that's focused on Apple development, people programming. It's a developer-focused conference, so it's all about software, and they did also talk about some really cool-looking hardware updates coming, like new iMac Pros, so that you can use a 12 or 20 or something core processor to write your show notes so much faster in WordPress because you know you need that to do that faster. But the big news for podcasters came not from the keynote, although that has some cool stuff in it. The big news for podcasters is what came on the last day of WWDC during a special podcast session that they had, where they gave a preview of the new podcast app, which is much nicer looking than before. It's significantly cleaned up, redesigned. It's a huge redesign for the app and focuses more on usability and has some neat things to it. But the big thing for podcasters, two things. One is they're adding some new RSS tags and updating the way some other tags work. So you'll have some new abilities to display your episodes a little bit differently inside of the Apple Podcasts app. The other big update is that they are bringing stats to podcasters. Previously, even inside of the Site Manager tool, which is a special tool by invitation only, certain podcast networks get access to that. And I've been one that I'm very grateful that Apple has given me access to Site Manager. So I can see from my own podcast network some of the stats. Apple has been able to track things, but even the stats they provide are only showing downloads or streams, and streams are progressive downloads. It's not a true stream. It's you click play or press play, and it starts downloading in the background while it starts playing immediately, because the MP3 file can work that kind of way. So they've been able to provide download stats, and we could get download stats much more reliably even with our own web host. But what Apple is bringing to podcasters is the ability to see consumption analytics. How many minutes are people listening to your episodes? When are they dropping out? Are they skipping? That kind of information. And this has been highly sought after in the podcast community. And we've had different ways of tracking this for many, many years. Like Stitcher, for example, can track and does report this kind of information to let you know when people drop out of Stitcher or how many minutes they listen to an episode. So you can get some realistic data like that. And there have been other tools that you can embed on your own website. More recently, Omni has revolutionized the space by releasing something never before seen, except we've seen it several years before, and certain website analytics and also forced tracking on some of those iTunes downloads or podcast app downloads. But we've had, years ago, we had something like Media Gauge. We've had other embeddable players or plugins that could embed and connect with your existing tools on your website to track how much do people listen to. The problem with all of these other things is that they focus on a very, very, very small subset of the audience of podcasts. Even with Omni's recent thing, that's really not as revolutionary as they're claiming it to be, but they are tracking only Apple Podcasts app users and only those who press play on the episode instead of download the full episode, which is an even smaller subset because the default behavior is to download the episode, not to progressively download it while playing, or stream, as they'll call it sometimes. But it's not technically a stream. So it was this tiny, tiny subset that is not necessarily a good representation of your overall podcast audience. What Apple is bringing is the ability to see listenership consumption analytics for downloads, already downloaded files, as well as those streams. For a while, it has been a little bit of a black box for once an episode downloads that we can't see then what's done with that episode. How much is listened to it? Do people skip through ads? Do they skip certain sections? Do they drop out near the end of the podcast? Do they drop out near the beginning? Anything like that. Now we're going to be able to see that, and that's from the Apple Podcasts ecosystem, which represents Apple Podcasts app on iOS. Will probably also represent iTunes on the desktop for Windows and Mac OS, although that is a shrinking portion of podcast consumption. It is still a large portion. So all total, this is going to give you analytics on, by average, 60 to 70% of your audience. That's what it is right now. That's how much of the podcast consumption that Apple delivers through their own podcast apps. And that's not even counting Android. I do still believe someday Apple will release an Apple Podcast app for Android. And then we would have a great option for people on Android to be able to subscribe, and we get those same stats. But for now, that remaining 30 to 40% is other podcast apps. Like, I personally use Overcast instead of the Apple Podcast app. Also, it could be Stitcher. It could be Android users. It could be BlackBerry, if BlackBerry is still a thing out there. It could be other types of consumption. But 60 to 75%, getting consumption analytics on that 60 to 75%, and recognizing that this is the most popular podcast app. It's not like it's an app designed around this behavior of live streaming or sitting down and watching a video or something like that. This, why I mentioned that is, if you put your audio podcast on YouTube as a fake video, the consumption expectations on YouTube are completely different than the expectations in a podcast app. So if people go on YouTube and start watching your fake video for your podcast, they're going to drop out extremely quickly. And that has less to do with your content than it does with your presentation in that particular context. Whereas in a regular podcast app, people are expecting to press play and listen to an entire episode. So recognizing that the Apple Podcast app represents 60 to 70% of your consumption, the data you get will be extremely accurate. No, it won't be 100% accurate, because you could easily make the case to say that, well, people on Android, like, here's a great example. Maybe you have This Week in Android podcast or something like that. So the consumption on Apple is probably going to be lower than your consumption on Android. And the people who listen on Apple may decide to stop listening halfway through the episode because they just are fed up with your bashing the phone and the device they're choosing to use to listen to or listen through at that moment. Whereas on the Android side, they listen all the way through because they're in that ecosystem. So there are going to be cases like that with this. But still, 60 to 70%, getting measurement on that is fantastic. The big thing you need to know about this is it does seem that this will come to all podcasters through the Podcast Connect website. Now that means that you have to log in with your Apple ID you use to submit your podcast. And right now, for some podcasters, that's not a possible thing to do. I really believe that maybe even this year, we will see Apple finally allow you the option of transferring ownership of a podcast from one app or from one account to another. They already do that in the App Store because it happens very often that someone wants to transfer ownership of an app from one person to another or from one company to another. They sell their app or something like that. So I'm quite certain we'll see that kind of thing as well in the podcast space, maybe later this year. So if you're not able to log in to get your podcast or someone else submitted it to Apple for you, I think you'll be able to access it later on. What I'm really encouraged by is that this is not limited to Site Manager. So that the stats, that's a really big thing. That's the main lead here in their story. And I'll dig into a lot more of this in more detail for a webinar, members-only webinar for Podcaster Society, and talk about how to use these different tools, as well as in my next episode of the Audacity to Podcast, the next one I'll record, that is, which will release near the end of June. In that episode, that'll release on June 20th. In that episode, I'll talk more about the specific feed tags and stats and stuff from Apple and what this could mean for podcasters. But for now, everything you've heard of is coming. It's not even available yet. The information they showed on a slide wasn't even for a real podcast. It was in their presentation, several of the Apple employees took part in this presentation, but then they start talking about best practices, and they made up a podcast, a fictional podcast, and showed made up data for that podcast. And you can kind of guess what certain dips are in the middle of the stats. But so it's not even available yet, but it is coming. They said later this year. I expect it will probably come around the same time as iOS 11 launches, because all of these new RSS tags and updates will also not be needed or not be supported until iOS 11 is released for iOS devices and the new podcast app comes available. So those other updates, now I want to talk about that before getting to the questions that I've received. Those couple updates, some new RSS tags, as well as some revised RSS tags. There's a lot of misconception already going around about this. And you know I like to really dig into things. I'm not going to say I have the absolute truth here, but I will say that I dig into this. I want to make sure I'm absolutely accurate with this information. One of the things that some people are cringing a little bit at is that Apple drew attention to the GUID tag, or the GUID. This is a tag I've talked about many times before with the Audacity to Podcast. The GUID, or GUID, is a globally unique identifier for each episode or for each item in an RSS feed. For many years, this has been a required item, and it's how RSS readers know whether that post is new. It's the GUID. So you could update the title. You could update everything about a podcast episode, the cover art, the title, the text, the file itself, change the file name, change the contents of the file, all of that. You could do that completely, and the episode would not be seen as a new episode unless you change that GUID. Now, if you change that GUID and you don't change anything else, podcast apps and RSS readers will see that as a completely new episode and re-download it. This is something I've talked about actually a year ago as one of those guaranteed ways to increase your podcast downloads without increasing your audience. And it's a thing that in that episode, I gave these recommendations tongue-in-cheek. Do not change the GUID. So Apple drew attention to this to say, and in their documentation, they even specifically say, assigning new GUIDs to existing episodes can cause issues with your podcast listing and chart placement in Apple Podcasts. Just before that, they said, assign the GUID to an episode only once and never change it. That's always been the case. what's new is that they're drawing attention to this and saying, don't change it. In my next episode, I'll discuss more about how that actually affects your chart placement, or some theories on how that affects your chart placement. But if you're thinking, I'm going to increase my downloads by forcing people to re-download my old episodes, then you are not a nice person. Don't do that. Don't force re-downloads like that. That's very unethical, very deceptive. And Apple is finally putting in writing to say, don't change that. And in their presentation, they mentioned that if you move media hosts or migrate your website, then that could change the GUIDs, but it is crucial that those GUIDs not be changed. So some of the new tags that they offered: iTunes type, iTunes season, iTunes episode, iTunes title, episode type, and they also updated some things about the summary and content encoded tags. I'll dig into these in much more detail in my upcoming episode and members-only webinar. But the big thing from this is, for one, well, a couple of the big things from this. One, they'll now support seasons. And this will display your episodes in a certain way and make the podcast app download your episodes in a certain way. All of this is in beta right now. And we won't know exactly how it works until the final release. It may work one way right now, but they may change their minds based on feedback and such. But we can have seasons. So if your show is a serialized show, where it's absolutely important for the sake of the story to start at episode 1. For example, there's a musical podcast at podmusical.com. It's called The Fall of the House of Sunshine, and it's a musical comedy serialized audio drama podcast. And it's a lot of fun, too. Not completely family friendly. There is some profanity and some other stuff in it, but it's extremely fun. So that's an episode that if you jump in at the latest episode, it won't make sense at all. So it's really important for you to start at episode 1. Apple is offering a way that you can tell the podcast app that your entire podcast type is serial, and therefore download or present and recommend the download and the listen from the oldest to the latest. And if you use seasons with this, it would also enable a user to download an entire season of episodes at a time, not only the first episode, and then have to go and download the additional episodes after that. You can also have seasons with standard episodic content. For example, I have a TV show fan podcast where episode by episode of the TV show, we do episodes of our podcast. We actually do 2 episodes of our podcast for each 1 episode of the TV show, or that's the way we've done it up until this point. So the new thing that they'll be doing that could apply to a show like that is, yes, that podcast for me is seasonal. I could have season 1, season 2, season 3, all the way up through season 6 so far. But I don't want to force people to download episode 1. If they found my podcast about the TV show, they're probably current on the TV show. So I want them to download the latest episode. So I would leave the type as episodic, but I can also use seasons with episodic. So a seasonal episodic by default would download the latest episode, but it would still have the segmentation for different seasons. You can't name those seasons. You can only give them a number that is something other than 0. And there is a new episode, iTunes episode tag, which is the episode number, and that can be based, or that can be relative to your episodes within a season. So you can have season 1, episode 1, and then you have season 2, episode 1, season 3, episode 1. So you can start the episode numbering over again, so that helps with the ordering within a single season. And so this season and episode number information ties in with the new tag, which is iTunes title. By default, podcast apps read the title tag for each item in the RSS feed, for each episode, that is. And that's the title that it displays in the app. there's no standard way to write your titles. People have been writing their titles in completely different ways, some good, some not so good. Some people will put their full podcast name, the name of their show, and then an episode number, and then the title of the episode. That's horrible. Or they won't even give each episode its own title at all. That's even worse. So this new iTunes title tag is a podcast-specific tag that at some point probably other podcast apps will start to support this as well. But right now it will be the Apple Podcast app focused. And that is where you put in the episode title. You don't put in serial, you don't put in the episode number, you don't put in the season number, anything like that. All you put in is the title. Then you put the episode number and the season information in these other tags. And this is all optional too. You could just continue doing things the way you've been doing them. But if you use this new title tag, what it will do is it will change what displays in the app based on certain context. Like if you're browsing a season, up at the top, it will say season 1. And then in the individual episode listings, at least this is the way it is in the beta, you'll see 1 period episode title. And then 2 period episode title. So those are your episode titles. But then when you press play on one of them, it may not display that episode number, like 1 period or 2 period. It may simply display the episode title, but then above that in smaller text, it'll say season 1, episode 2. So what this does is it makes for a much better user experience that you don't have to put that information in your title. You can put that information in these other places and it will display appropriately to the podcast app. This could also be a cool way that you could display easily, regardless of what's making your RSS feed or which RSS feed you're using. You could display a different title in a podcast app than you display on your website. We've already had that ability before. If you make a separate podcast-only RSS feed from your website, you could then give those items their individual titles. And PowerPress supports that. It's been supporting that for a couple of years. There are some other cool things about this, like episode types, some updated information about the summary and content encoded tags, but I'll talk more about those in the June 20th episode of the Audacity podcast, as well as my members-only webinar for Podcaster Society, which will actually be this week at the time of this recording. That'll be on June 15th, 2017. Podcaster Society, by the way, is not open yet for new members, but it will be reopening soon. And that's my members only, or my podcasters only community. You can't join if you haven't launched a podcast yet. It's for you if you've started a podcast and want to make that podcast even better. You can join the waiting list over at podcastersociety.com. And this week I'll be talking more about these separate tags, some thoughts on them and such. And I'll give a more concise version in my upcoming episode of the Audacity podcast. So now on to these questions that I've received. And there's a lot more information, I'm sure, to discuss about the Apple announcements. Wallace Durham asked, I was recording my introductory podcast last week and noticed the green timeline moving fast. I kept speaking and at about 20 minutes, it stopped. I spoke about 10 minutes more and concluded. On playback, the show did stop at those 20 minutes. I want at least an hour of recording. Does this have to do with bit depth or zoom? My sample rate is set at 44.1 kilohertz. Was told that 96 kilobits per second is standard for podcasts. Well, Wallace, there could be a couple strange things going on here. First, it depends greatly on what you're recording into. It sounds like you're recording into an app, maybe Audacity, maybe something else. But if you're recording into your computer, make sure you have as few other programs running as possible. And make sure you have as much free space as possible. Because one thing that makes me think could be happening is that your hard drive is filling up, or maybe your RAM is filling up. And so the recording app can't do any more, and it just stops because you filled up the resources in the app. And so it has to stop. And then when you start again, it's starting back over with empty resources. The other thing is maybe you have something on your computer that's hogging the CPU or RAM and stealing resources from the recording. So don't play videos, especially, or maybe video games can hog a lot of CPU and RAM from your computer. Another thing that could be happening is maybe you're bumping the button. Maybe like the space bar, for example, or R or some other button on your keyboard could be causing it to pause. And there's even a chance that maybe, depending on how you have your recorder set up, it's set to record audio at a certain volume. It has some kind of activated automatic recording set up. So maybe it hears you talk and it's recording, and then you stop for a little while and it stops recording but doesn't restart. There could be a lot of different things going on here in the process. So some things to look into. Make sure that you have your computer doing as little as possible while you're recording. And that will also ensure that your CPU fans aren't having to rev up so high and causing a lot of background noise. Like what I'm doing right now, where I'm live streaming this, even though I'm also recording it, this is creating a lot of demand on my CPU. And so my CPU fan is revving up and the audio quality is suffering. You probably can't hear it all that much, especially when I stop talking. But there is a fan in the background constantly going that is reducing the audio quality. And so it's a constant hiss because I'm doing so much on my CPU. You said your sample rate's 44.1 kilohertz. That's fine. So there's no problem with bit depth or zoom. Now, you did say was told 96 kilobits per second is standard for podcasting. No, that's not true. There's not an exact standard, but the most common and most practical standards you could follow would be if you're releasing your audio in stereo, and it has to be in stereo, like you're doing audio dramas or sound seeing tours or music reviews, that kind of thing where you need that stereo spatial relationship, then you would want to release in stereo. And at stereo, 128 kilobits per second joint stereo is the best option. If all you're doing is spoken word, or that's the majority of your content, and by the way, with spoken word, there's absolutely no good reason to place voices in different ears, even slightly one way or the other. Don't do it. So if you're thinking, oh, I'll put one host in the left and one host in the right, please don't do that. Even in audio drama, do that only when it's absolutely necessary. Like you're hearing someone and you want the mental impression that they're off in the distance, off to one side or something like that. But most dialogue should happen centered. Even the major movies put the voices in the center channel unless there's some kind of special effect. So that aside, you could release your podcast simply in mono then. So 128 kilobits per second joint stereo is as close to a standard as we have. And if you're releasing in mono, which would then give you half the file size, you can release at 64 kilobits per second in mono. And at that size, you'd be at about half a megabyte per minute of audio. At 128 kilobits per second, you'd be about 1 megabyte per minute of audio. And the smaller file size still maintains that nice quality. It's fantastic for spoken word, certainly. Yeah, your music may not sound the absolute best, but probably no one listens to a podcast simply because of the music, and they might not even notice if the music was mono. Unless you're doing a music review podcast, then you need it to be in stereo so you can hear the full depth of the music. Mono, 64 kilobits per second, or stereo, 128 kilobits per second, joint stereo. Derek Grosskurth said, hey, you mentioned on an interview you know the coding to change the Libsyn author tag per episode. What is it? On Libsyn, if you're using Libsyn to create your RSS feed, not only to host your media, but create your RSS feed, and they are a good company for that. By the way, you can use my affiliate code Noodle to get all of this month and the rest and all of next month for free when you sign up at Libsyn.com. But right now, at least, when you want to set the individual author for an episode, for SEO or whatever reasons, you don't have to, but if you want to, then right now you have to do it through an advanced tag in the episode editor inside of Libsyn. I really think that will probably change in the future, but for now, you can do it. And the code, look at the notes or the description of this video, and I have the code in there So you can simply copy and paste and update for your own use. But I'll describe it to you. It's the, let's see, the greater, which way is that? The bracket, less than that. Yes. Okay, so it's less than sign, iTunes, author, greater sign, and no spaces in that. And then you enter the author name, and that can have spaces. And then you do less than slash or / iTunes, author, greater than sign. You're basically writing what looks like HTML. It's really an XML tag. But it's that iTunes, author on both sides. The tag will look the same, except the last one has the / because that's a way to close it. It sounds a little bit weird when I'm describing it like that. Look at the description for this video to get the actual text, so you can copy and paste that into the advanced tags field inside of Libsyn. That will probably not be necessary later on, because Libsyn will probably support the individual episode author tag when they also implement support for these new iTunes tags from Apple, as well as PowerPress will support the new tags soon. You don't need them right away. There's really no purpose to put them in right away. But before iOS 11 comes out, I'm sure both of these tools will support these new tags. And if you're using a podcasting tool that doesn't have these new tags supported by the time iOS 11 is released, you should probably consider switching tools to someone who keeps up with the podcasting industry. Andrea Steele asked or said, I'm a newbie considering a podcast on Blubrry. I need a simple to use host. Do you recommend them? Would the word Blubrry appear in my domain name? I would like to advertise / monetize. Well, Andrea, it depends on how you use Blubrry, because there are now a few options to it. And with Blubrry, if you'd like to save some money to sign up, get your first month free, you can use my affiliate code Noodle, and that gives you your first month free over there of any of their services that they provide. Premium hosting, premium stats, or their new PowerPress sites option. So they offer a few different things here. And based on your comment, I'm not exactly sure which one of these you're considering, but I'll explain each of them. You could have your own WordPress-powered website on your own domain, and you use Blubrry to host your media. So you attach that to PowerPress inside of your WordPress website. You sign up for Blubrry using the promo code Noodle. You get a month free, and then you pay per month after that. And then through WordPress, your WordPress site on your own domain, on your own web serving hosting account somewhere, then you're uploading your media files. They go over to Blubrry and publish inside of PowerPress. So you're using Blubrry as a media host. That's one option. So then Blubrry appears nowhere in your domain. The other option is if you are using Blubrry's website, that they give you this option. They call it PowerPress sites now. And these are sites, basic sites that you can use for your podcast. And if you sign up with any podcast hosting plan, you get a basic PowerPress site. And the basic PowerPress site is managed WordPress. It has SSL, it has daily backups, but you can't bring your own .com. So yes, Blubrry would appear in the name. So it might be like myawesomepodcast.blubrry.com. You don't get email forwarding, DNS management, membership site. You only get an essential amount of plugins. You get some limited search engine optimization use, but it can be fine for you to start. But you don't get your own .com. You could forward a .com, like myawesomepodcast.com could forward to the Blubrry site. But when people are on your site browsing your pages, in the address bar, it won't say your domain. It'll say Blubrry's domain. That's the basic version. You can upgrade to use Blubrry's PowerPress sites instead of your own WordPress website. So their deluxe option is $20 a month in addition to whatever media hosting plan you sign up for. That's also a managed WordPress website. You also get an SSL certificate. You also get daily backups. But with that $20 a month, you can use your own .com or your own domain. like myawesomepodcast.com. You can manage the DNS. You can forward email addresses to different places. It supports a lot more visitors. You get more plugins that you can activate or deactivate on your website. You get the choice of more than 5 different WordPress themes that you could use with your website, and you get advanced search engine optimization tools on that site. You can't even go higher than that at $50 a month, and you get developer tools and the ability to run a multi-site or a membership website. So that's a lot more advanced, and you get unlimited plugins, unlimited themes, a lot of other stuff. This is more a rival to WP Engine, but it's designed specifically for podcasting. So you can check these out at blubrry.com, and that's without the E's. Go to blubrry.com and use the promo code Noodle, and you can check out their PowerPress sites option. So with these more expensive, the $20 a month and $50 a month, you can bring and should bring your own domain to it. So then when people are visiting your website, they're staying on your domain. They're not on a blubrry.com domain or anything like that. But if you use their basic site with your podcast hosting, then yes, Blubrry will be in the domain. Daniel Sinclair asked, saying, he asked this or posted this question. I use WordPress, and I thought for search engine optimization, it's good to have the URL of the podcast episode be similar to the title of the episode. But I see you also have a URL set to domain.com/79, where 79 is your episode number. How do you do that? With a plugin? Is that in addition to the other URL, or does it replace it? In WordPress, you have the ability, but I don't recommend you do this. You have the ability to change what's called the slug for each page or each post. That is inside the WordPress editor, right below you, where you type the title of the page or post. There's the URL that's displayed of what that will be when you publish it. You have the ability to change that to something else. Don't. Let it be the full title with all of your nice keywords and stuff in it. You could change it to something that's a little more descriptive or maybe something better, but just in general, leave that. Do not change that to /episode number or /episode keyword or anything like that. Let it be the full URL. That does help you with search engine optimization, so people can find your content for those relevant keywords. There are 2 different ways that you could then make these /79 URLs, different plugins, and that would be by making redirects. I highly recommend PrettyLink, and specifically PrettyLink Pro. The reason I recommend PrettyLink Pro over PrettyLink Lite, the free version, is in PrettyLink Pro, you can enable automatic page and post pretty links, which will place a little box inside of your editor where you can set the pretty link for that episode right there inside of your page or post editor. If you use the Pretty Link Lite version, then it's a few extra steps where you have to publish your post, then copy the URL, then go into Pretty Link, create a new Pretty Link, paste that URL, then go down and set your episode number in the /whatever field, and then save that. So Pretty Link Pro saves a bunch of steps, and it has a whole bunch of other nice features with it as well. I highly recommend Pretty Link Pro. If you go to the audacitypodcast.com/PrettyLinkPro, that's my affiliate link for Pretty Link Pro. Unfortunately, I can't offer you a discount, but if you purchase through that link, then they'll see that I referred you to them, and I'll even get a little bit of a compensation for that referral. The other option you could use is Simple Podcast Press. This is an advanced player that you can embed in your WordPress website, and it can even go on top of PowerPress, and it's really nice. I now use it on all of the Noodle.mx network podcast websites. It's a better looking player, has a lot better features built into it, and you can also create those individual episode number posts because it will add a nice little URL, a simple URL field that you can set for each post. And these are redirects. So if you enter theaudacitypodcast.com/300, it will take you over to that post with a full URL in it. It's a redirect. Simple Podcast Press and Pretty Link Pro are both paid plugins. Now, for Simple Podcast Press, if you use the promo code Noodle, you'll save 20% on that plugin. It's a great plugin. I use it. I pay for it. I like it. Same thing with Pretty Link Pro. I use it, pay for it, like it. If you get the Pretty Link Lite version, which is free, then you do have to go through those multiple steps to create the Pretty Link for each individual episode or each individual page on your site. But you can still have the same kind of Pretty Link where it's /episode number, /episode keyword, anything like that. But it's more steps than if you were on Pretty Link Pro. Pretty Link Pro also provides some other fantastic features that I like, and some cool things that you can do with monetization, with some automation, with some other really cool things, especially helpful for podcasters. And while I'm on the subject of search engine optimization, or SEO, Emily Prokop said, do you think you'll end up revamping and updating the SEO for Podcasters course because of these changes? Yes, I will. There are several changes in search engine optimization for podcasters. So I will be updating the SEO for Podcasters course. Anyone who's purchased that course before will receive the new version for free. And all members of Podcaster Society will have access to that. They'll actually get the new version before anyone else does. But right now, I'm working on my Zoom H6 for Podcasters course, which will be available first to members of Podcaster Society, and then later as a standalone purchase for anyone not inside of the Podcaster Society. Last question then is Sarah De Kashia. I'm not good with pronouncing names. Let me see if she replied to explain a pronunciation. No, she didn't yet. So Sarah asked, what's a good way to start out on a podcast? Do you jump right in with the first few episodes, or do you acknowledge it in some way? I did tweet her back to ask her a little bit more clarification on this, but I think this is, I think I understand the way she's asking this. What I recommend is that you acknowledge along the way, but jump right in. You look at TV shows, in the first episode of the TV show, the pilot, they put so much effort and attention into making that one of their best episodes because that's the thing that'll hook people in. Although you get to meet the characters along the way in the pilot episode, that pilot episode is not like, okay, everybody, here's character one. Character one has this backstory, and we're going to tell you about. You learn it. You learn the backstory. You learn about the characters along the way as you're getting the story. So from episode one of TV shows, they give you stories. They give you that story you want. Episode 2, episode 3, and so on. And along the way, as you're getting the stories, the content you're coming to the show for, you're getting to know the characters better and better and better. And depending on the type of show, sometimes they dig more or focus more on character backstory than other shows. But you get to know them along the way. It's not like laid out in an introduction episode. It's boom, story right away. So with your podcast, do jump right in. Your first episode will be one of your most downloaded episodes. And I recommend that from the beginning, you focus on presenting value. There can be some introduction and some acknowledgement of this being a new podcast along the way, but not a full episode about this is who I am, this is what the podcast is going to be about. You can make a little trailer, like a 30-second or a 60-second promo for your podcast. Certainly put that up as an episode 0 or something like that, and then maybe remove it later on when your podcast has actually started. But make that first episode be solid value. So when people hear that, it's not all about you. In a sense, they'll feel like it's about them because it's the content they want. And along the way, they get to know you. So your first episode could be a list of things. It could include introductions. It could include information about the new podcast, what's coming and such. But make sure that that first episode gives your audience what they're coming for. Not giving them a bunch of promises. Give them content. Fulfill promises from your first episode. And in the course of that, or near the end of that episode, you can say, thanks for listening to this first episode of the podcast. I hope you'll stick around because I'm really excited about where I'm going to take the podcast in the future. So until next time, or here's what's coming in the future, or anything like that. And for telling your own story too, you can bring that out across many episodes or in that first episode. But whenever you present content, focus on giving value to your audience. Give them what they came for, which will be that content. So for example, if I was going to start the Audacity to podcast over from scratch, and I've already done an episode where I criticized and critiqued my first episode of the Audacity to podcast. It was a fun episode, actually, too, where I talked about what you can do with your first episode to prepare for it or to learn from your first episode so you can make a podcast much better. But today, if I were to start the Audacity to podcast all over from the beginning, my first episode would probably be something like, what does it take to podcast? Or maybe it would be, why should you podcast? That would probably make a better first episode. Why you should podcast. And in that first episode, then, along the way, I can tell some of my story. Like I can say something like, you should start a podcast because your podcast could be that beacon of hope in someone's otherwise horrible day. They could hate their job, they could be struggling in their family, but they know on Tuesdays, they have an episode of their favorite podcast to listen to. And maybe that's the only thing they have to look forward to in life. So there I'm providing some content, I'm giving a message, and I can add then to that some of my personal story to say, that's kind of how I discovered podcasts. I'd gotten tired of my long commute back and forth to and from work, a 75-minute drive one way. I'd gone through audiobooks. I'd gotten tired of local talk radio. Then I discovered podcasts, and I started enjoying the commute again. Even today, I absolutely hate mowing the yard, but I'll save certain podcasts for when I mow the yard, and it makes me actually somewhat look forward to mowing the yard because I know I get to listen to that podcast while I'm mowing. So you see, I've told a little bit of my story while I've also presented value. From the beginning, present value, and you can incorporate your story along with that. You can incorporate setting the expectations along with that. Like in that first episode, I could say something like, and I'll talk more about how to make a life-changing podcast in a future episode of the Audacity to podcast. So I hope you'll stick around for all of those future episodes. So you see, it's giving value, setting expectations, telling a little bit of the story, but focusing on giving value first. So it's okay if along the way you say, this is a new podcast, I hope you'll stick around, or here's what I'm planning to do with the podcast, but don't make that the main focus. Make the content the main focus. Deliver what your audience is coming for. So for the Audacity to podcast, the episode that's coming up next, I wanted to fulfill my promise from last week where I did an episode about making your content live longer, which works primarily for timeless content episodes where it can apply years later. And then in the episode that we'll publish on Tuesday, June 13th, I'll be talking about how you can use a current events-based podcast to grow your audience. So a podcast that maybe doesn't have a very long shelf life. People aren't listening to those podcast episodes years later, maybe only days or weeks later, but then after that, they don't really care because it's so tied to current events. How can you leverage a podcast like that to grow your audience when it's so focused on current stuff? You can't promote your old episodes. So I share some ways that you can do that in the next episode of the Audacity to podcast, publishing on June 13th, 2017. And then the episode, June 20th, 2017, will be digging into more detail about the stats and updates from Apple and how to use some of this information and practical examples of that. And I'll get a lot more in depth with that information in my upcoming members only webinar for Podcasters Society. If you have questions that you'd like me to address in one of these podcasting Q&As, then please email me feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com, or you can always send a message through the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com. And I will save that to incorporate in one of these future Q&As, which I do on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching.